Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name's Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and I'm talking about the Dresden Files yet again. I love this series so much, and now that I'm finally caught up, I finished Peace Talks and Battleground, and I talked about it on the channel. I've been looking back on the series and kind of thinking about what I liked about it, maybe what I didn't like about it, and of course, what my favorite books were in this journey. So today I'm talking my top 5 Dresden Files books. Give or take that there's 17 books in this series, plus 2 short story collections and a handful of comics. There's a lot to talk about. I'm gonna only be talking about the actual novels in the series today, as well as discussing some honorable mentions and books that I really like but just didn't quite make the top 5. So let's get into it. This was a hard list to put together, especially the books that were like ranked 4 and 5 in this list. There was a lot that really could have made the top 5, but I've made my top 5 and I'm gonna stick to it for now, and if you hear me change my opinions in the future, then that's just probably gonna happen. And just be warned, for this video, I will be talking mild spoilers, nothing that's gonna ruin the experience of actually reading these books, but just enough to give the context of why I like them and why they rank the way they do in my list. So let's start in at number 5. Number 5 is White Knight, book 9 in the series. Coming in after the highs of Deadbeat and Proven Guilty, White Knight was a book I was quite looking forward to, but I knew it was going to be a bit on a smaller scale compared to the last two, and I heard it lean a bit more back into the mystery elements in the series that the books were kind of moving away from as they went along. And White Knight was actually the first Dresden Files book I listened to on audio, and the first major audiobook I kind of did in this push in starting this channel to read more books and to expand my reading horizons. And this was a great book to pick for it because it wasn't the longest book, and I was fortunate enough to have James Marsters, the excellent narrator of the Dresden Files books, be that guiding hand into audiobooks for me. It was such a great experience. And people were right, White Knight leaned into those mystery elements that I was kind of missing at that point. It was a classic murder mystery setup that of course expanded into bigger and more interesting things, and had some really interesting turns for some of our major characters and intriguing mysteries as to what they were up to and who was pulling the strings in all these murders and what was going on. And it had a really explosive ending. I remember just listening to this and going like, what the hell is going on? This is crazy. Starting from a very kind of lower stakes mystery setup where it's just a dead body, going all the way to this crazy ending was something I really valued and really appreciated for my first audiobook experience in the Dresden Files. At number 4, we have Cold Days. So Cold Days is part of that arc that kind of started with Ghost Story, following up on the crazy events of changes that led up all the way to Peace Talks and Battleground, and it was just hit after hit in that series, with the exception of Ghost Story, which I wasn't too big of a fan of. And Cold Days was a great change of pace coming after Ghost Story. Harry is finally back in action. He's trying to pick up the pieces of what happened in changes in Ghost Story, and his new role within the Winter Court being kind of the forefront of what's happening in this story. And the goal he's given to accomplish in this was absolutely crazy, and I was just completely left guessing as to where it was gonna go. While it didn't maybe have that classic mystery noir vibe that the earlier books had, there was an engaging mystery and goal in this one as to how Harry was gonna accomplish this task, and him with his new abilities and his new role, seeing that be fleshed out in the world. And of course, the epic, crazy finale of this book where there are so many twists and turns and so many incredible changes for some of our main cast that have had repercussions throughout the series after that. And honestly, I just really enjoy the books that feature the fairy courts. The Winter Queen, Mab, is such an intimidating and mysterious character, and learning more about her world, the Summer Court, and all the creatures and characters that come within that has always been very interesting, and a lot of the highs in the series for me. Coming in at number 3, we have Turncoat. This is a book that I've heard mixed things on. People seem to love it, some people seem to not like it as much, but I absolutely love this book. Turncoat is book 11 in the series and was the final book before that whole arc of the first 12-ish books kind of wrapped up in changes. And this one had a really cool story set up, a really interesting hook where Harry's forced to partner up with someone who's kind of been an antagonist throughout the first series of books, who believes they're being wrongfully accused and have come to Harry for help, which in itself was a crazy setup anyway. Now Harry has to try to see who actually did what this person is being set up for, and if they're actually being set up or guilty. I thought it was a really awesome hook, and it created such a great sense of propulsion right from the beginning of the book, where the first thing that happens is this person just falls onto Harry's doorstep, and it was so awesome. And having that sense of dramatic tension throughout the whole book, where Harry's trying to prove this person's innocence and also shelter this person and keep them out of the eyes of people that they're being hunted by, who may be some of Harry's allies, was really great. And this book, especially coming off of Small Favor book 10, I thought this one did a really good job of having a very dangerous and intimidating antagonist. In Small Favor book 10, we were revisited by the Denarians and Nicodemus, which up until Skin Game hadn't really been my favorite villains. I actually kind of, when I got to them in a book, would be like, it's these guys again. But book 11 really kicked up the stakes with the antagonist in it, someone who felt so incredibly scary and dangerous. And the first time we meet them, we kind of say, holy shit, what is Harry up against? And how is he gonna accomplish his goals of overcoming this crazy, insane bad guy? It also had a really interesting finale where it was pretty explosive, like any Dresden Files finale, and it had another final act sort of on top of that, where the mystery of everything was being wrapped up, and there were a lot of twists and turns, and I thought that was really exciting, which is why this is number 3 on my list. At number 2, we have maybe the obvious choice for a lot of people for number 1, but for me it's number 2, and that's book 12, Changes. Right from the first line of this book, everything is different for Harry Dresden. His entire world is upended, and he's set on this adventure, this journey, this story that absolutely, completely changes his life. Nothing is the same going forward from here, and this was the highest stakes, craziest, most emotionally tense and riveting book. It felt like everything that was being built up in the first 11 books prior to this was being paid off here. It felt like danger was at its highest level. Harry had the highest emotional stakes in any story, and everything came to a head with the war with the Red Court, which had been happening since book 3. And it wasn't just kind of a one-off book where he deals with one faction or one enemy and then it's wrapped up and he moves on to the next story. And here, Harry has to go and deal with so many different kinds of characters and factions in order to achieve his goal. And then in the final conflict there, it probably wasn't the biggest on a physical scale of the Dresden Files finales, but it definitely had the biggest emotional weight and some of the best character moments for a lot of our main cast. And of course, the way things were wrapped up was absolutely insane and changed the course of the entire series from there. So Changes, maybe the best book in the series, but number 2 on my list. So before I get into my favorite book, I wanted to talk about some honorable mentions first and just discuss maybe why I like those books and maybe why they didn't quite make the top 5. So my first honorable mention is Skin Game, book 15 in the series. This was a book that I came to, and having learned who the villains were in this one, again was a little like, it's these guys again. We'll see if this one's any good. But this book had a really interesting hook. It was a heist, and Harry had to team up with an antagonist and kind of a evil version of Ocean's 11, a grouping of protagonists and antagonists that kind of had to team up to accomplish this goal. And I thought that was really exciting, and it leaned a bit more into the crime elements I was missing a bit. And this book actually made me turn a bit on my opinions of these bad guys that I didn't really get fully invested in, and I'm very interested to see how they're going to be handled going forward in the series. This one also had some really amazing moments and some really funny moments as well, and some great epic character moments that I won't spoil, but there's a character now who's in sort of a different place and much stronger than they were when we were first introduced to them, and that big turn happened in this book, and it was great to see. And of course, I do enjoy any book where I get to see Michael Carpenter, even though he's often paired in books with those villains I'm not very invested in, but he's such an amazing, well-drawn character that I always like to see, and when he shows up in a story, it's like revisiting an old friend. And of course, his involvement in this book and what he goes through made me really appreciate him even more. My second honorable mention is Peace Talks and Battleground. I'm going to consider this one book because it's one story. It's essentially a part 1 and part 2 that was just broken in half. These 2 books were absolutely crazy. These are the last 2 in the series, books 16 and 17, and the stakes are at their absolute highest. Physically, maybe not as emotionally high, except for one scene compared to Changes, but the world was completely upended, and all the things that had been set up, every single faction, I'm pretty sure in the Dresden Files, maybe missing 1 or 2, shows up here and has a role to play. And the stuff Harry has to accomplish and what he's able to do here is just so far beyond how the character started off in the first couple of books. It's crazy to see his evolution from the beginning until now. I did talk my full thoughts on Peace Talks and Battleground in the review I just put out the other week, so check that out if you want to hear a more kind of detailed breakdown of Peace Talks and Battleground, but I absolutely enjoyed these ones. There are a few things that quite didn't work for me, but overall, in the grand scope of the whole series, I really did enjoy this one. Another one of my honorable mentions is book 8 in the series, Proven Guilty. Coming in after Deadbeat, I was surprised to see a book that hit a lot of the same highs. It was very fun. It had a very interesting hook where Harry has to investigate things happening at a horror movie convention, and some familiar horror movie monsters show up, and of course that expanding and getting even bigger into the final act, where usually in a Dresden Files book the murder or whatever happens, the mystery gets resolved and then the book's over, but this one had a final act on top of that where the action was kicked into high gear, the stakes even higher, and went into a different realm that I wasn't necessarily expecting. My next honorable mention is the first book in the series, and that's Stormfront. While maybe it's not the best book, and probably when I go to revisit it I'll see a lot of flaws, especially compared to how great the recent books have become and kind of where things started versus how they are now, I really did enjoy Stormfront. It was very much leaning into those noir detective hard-boiled tropes that of course the series was kind of relying upon in those first few entries, and that's something I didn't mind. Honestly, I'm a big fan of that genre. Hard-boiled detective fiction is one of my favorite things out there, so having that initially with that mix of the fantasy stuff, and the fantasy stuff is a lot lower in the first book than it becomes, say, like in Peace Talks and Battleground, where everything is crazy, super high fantasy stakes. But I gotta show some appreciation for where the series all started out, for introducing us to Harry, Murphy, and the world of the Dresden Files, so that's why it's one of my honorable mentions. And my last honorable mention is a book that I know most people really didn't like, but I liked a lot, and I in fact liked it more than the first book when I read it, and that's Full Moon, book 2. Honestly, I just really had a great time with this one. It was kind of a breakneck pace of action. It started with the classic noir setup where there's a murder mystery and Harry has to find out what's going on, and we really get to learn a lot about more of the world in this one, and I enjoyed that, learning more of werewolves and kind of breaking down the rules of the different kind of werewolves and how they transform, who the people are, and of course who committed the crime. And this was the first entry, especially compared to the first book, where the ending had that crazy third act explosive finale where things were all just going off and everything was being paid off, and it was so cool. And it reminded me a lot of the final act of The Prisoner of Azkaban, which is one of my favorite Harry Potter books. I thought this one felt a lot darker, scarier, and more dangerous than the first book, especially the midpoint scene in the police precinct. So I know a lot of you out there don't like this book, and maybe my opinion will change if I go back and do a reread, but as it stands right now, Full Moon is one of my honorable mentions. Alright, so that's it for entries 5 to 2 on my list and my honorable mentions. And if you followed my channel before, you probably know what number 1 is, but number 1 on my list is Deadbeat, book 7 in the series. Deadbeat saved this series for me, honestly. I've mentioned this in the past as well, but after book 6, Blood Rights, I was a little like, on the series. Like, Blood Rights was very rote and formulaic and didn't really offer anything interesting or new outside of some tidbits of learning about more of the White Court of Vampires, but I thought it was very okay and was really unbalanced and had an A plot and a B plot that didn't really mesh well together. But Deadbeat saved the series for me. Deadbeat was so fun. It had great crime vibes starting off the whole story, and Harry doing his classic investigating, learning a lot more about elements like necromancy and zombies, and the involvement of some characters that of course grown to be more than they were at that time, but Polka will never die, and if you know what I'm talking about, that was one of the best moments in the book. A super fun epic finale where Harry has to take on the role of something we didn't quite expect him to do, and the way he charges into the final act of course was an amazing moment. This one I think had the best blend of dark and dangerous classic Dresden Files stuff and being absolutely hilarious and so much fun to read. And I think if I'm going to go back and just read one book in the series just for my own enjoyment, it's going to be Deadbeat. So that's it for my top 5 list of my favorite Dresden Files books, including some honorable mentions. So this made it into more like a top 10-ish list. If you're a fan of the series, let me know if you agree with my list, and if not, how would you place your top 5? So before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. That really helps. And as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.